Good morning, dear students. Welcome to the class. Hope you all are happy and safe at home, enjoying the new learning experience. Well, now it's not so new. You are used to of it now. You are learning so many things through these online classes. Well, let's quickly recap what we have discussed in the previous session. In the previous session, we have discussed about flowers, the most attractive part of the flower. We have discussed that flower is the reproductive part of the plant. It is a modified shoot. We have also discussed that a flower is composed of 4 whorls, that is the calyx, corolla, androecium, and gynoecium. Calyx and corolla are the accessory whorls of the flower which help in pollination, whereas androecium and gynoecium, they are the essential whorls of the flower which further help in fertilization and finally in the production of the seeds and the fruits. We have discussed that stamens form male reproductive whorl, whereas carpel or pistil, it forms the female reproductive whorl. Then we have discussed about the types of flowers, where you have learnt that flower which have all the 4 whorls present in them, they are called as complete flowers or bisexual flowers. Then we have discussed that there are some flowers which have only male reproductive whorl. So such flowers are called as staminate flowers. And those flowers which have only the female reproductive whorl present in them, they are called as pistillate flowers. So we can consider these types of flowers, that is pistillate or staminate flowers, as incomplete or unisexual flowers. Then we have also discussed that pollen grains are the male gametes of the flower and they are formed in the stamens, whereas eggs or ova are the female gametes and they are formed in the ovary of the flower. Well, now as you know about the complete flower, let's move on to the next topic, that is reproduction in plants. What does that mean? Reproduction in plants means production of a new plant from the parent plant. Now, in this process, in reproduction, what happens? In reproduction in plants, the fusion of the male and the female gamete takes place. Now, what is female gamete and what is male gamete? Male gamete of the flower is the pollen grains. Where it is produced? It is produced in the stamens. And which is the female gamete of the flower? The eggs or the ova, which is produced in the basal part of the pistil, that is in the ovary. So the eggs are produced in the ovary, which when fuses with the male gamete helps in the production of new flower, new plant. So this process involves 2 steps, that is pollination and fertilization. And today we are going to discuss in detail about pollination. Today we are going to learn about pollination. Look at these flowers. They are so beautiful. There are a variety of flowers with different colors, attractive colors in them, and they are very attractive. But all these flowers have something in them which make us sneeze. Do you know what? I will tell you. That's the pollen grain present in the stamens. As you can see in this module, a stamen is shown which is composed of pollen grains. It is fine powder, usually yellow in color, and this pollen grain makes us sneeze if it enters into the nasal passage. Flowers use pollen to make seeds and fruits through a process called pollination. Okay, do you see these yellow feathery parts of the flower? Just to see clearly in this module. This is the male reproductive organ, which is called as the stamen. What is this? This is the male reproductive organ called the stamen, and this is the place where the pollen is made. And what is this center part called? The center pink or reddish pink part of the flower is called the pistil, which is the female part of the flower. This is where the pollen needs to go so that the flower can make the seeds. Now, look at this flower. Looking at this flower, do you think that the yellow parts are stamen or the pistil? Now, I suppose it's clear to you that the yellow part which is visible is the stamen, which is the male part of the flower, and that makes pollen. And in this second flower, can you guess which is the stamen and which is the pistil? Yes, the yellowish part which is visible is the stamen composed of pollen grains, and the center whitish part is the pistil. In the next flower also you can see the center part, it shows the gynoecium, that is the pistil, the female reproductive part, and around it is the male reproductive part called the stamen. Then in this flower also you can see the yellowish part, it shows the stamens, and the center purplish part shows the pistil. So in all these flowers you can see the color of the stamen, the color of the pollen grains. It is yellow in color. The stamen is composed of anther and filament, and it is usually yellow in color. Well, there are flowers which have both the stamen and the pistil, and there are certain flowers which have either pistil or the stamen. So, all these undergo the process of pollination, whether it is a flower with both male and female flower, or it is a flower with only male flower or only female flower. They undergo the process of pollination. But the question arises, do these pollen grains move on its own? No. Pollen grains cannot move by itself. So, how will it reach to the pistil? Any guesses? Yes, absolutely right. With the help of the agents. How they will move? It will be moving with the help of the agents, that they are called as pollinators. What are they called? They are called pollinators. Now looking at this module, can you recognize this pollinator? Very good. That's a honeybee. It's a pollinator. And you can see the yellow pollen grain on its legs. Is it visible to everyone? Yes. It's clearly visible in the second part of the picture that the yellow pollen grains are stuck to its legs. So pollinators are pollen helpers or agents which help moving the pollen grains to the pistil, and so the flower can make the seeds. Let's look at some other pollinators. Do you know what these pollinators are called? Yes, very good. The first part shows a butterfly, which is called as a pollinator. And the second picture shows a hummingbird. Hummingbirds are also pollinators. Some other pollinators include wasps, ants. They all are termed as pollinators. Means the agents for transfer of pollen grains. Now let's discuss what we have discussed till now. What is this fine powdery substance present on the stamens called? That's right, it's called as pollen grain. Then what is it called that helps in the production of pollen grains? Yes, it's called as stamen. Then, which part of the flower is responsible to receive the pollen grains? Yes, very good. It's the pistil which takes the pollen grains and further proceeds with the process of fertilization. So, this part of the flower is where the pollen grains needs to go so that the flowers can make seeds. So, what is this part called? Yes, it is called as pistil. It is the female part of the flower where pollen needs to reach so that the flower can make seeds and fruits. Now, the next question is, what is the process called when pollen is moved from the stamen to the pistil? What is the process called when the stamen of the flower is moved to the pistil of the flower? The process is called as pollination. What it is called? Pollination. When the pollen is moved from the stamen of a flower to the pistil of a flower, it is called as pollination. So we can also say that the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of the same flower or another flower of the same kind or same species, it is called as pollination. Then comes the next question. What is the name of the pollen agents or helpers who move the pollen from anther to the stigma? It is the pollinators like bees, butterflies, wasps, ants, etc. Now, as you know how the flowers around you make more flowers, and pollinators help them through a process called pollination so that they can make the seeds and fruits. Now, let's move on in detail about pollination. You have learned that pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the flower, right? So based on whether the pollen grains are transferred within the same plants or it is transferred between two different plants, we can classify them as self-pollination and cross-pollination. What are the two categories, two types? It is self-pollination and cross-pollination. First, let's talk about self-pollination. In self-pollination, as it is very clear from the word itself, the name suggests that if the pollen grains are transferred within the same plant, then we'll say it's self-pollination. Self-pollination takes place in two ways. The first way is if the pollen grains get transferred within the same flower. As you can see in the module, the stamen, which is composed of the pollen grains are transferred from the anther of the same flower to the pistil of the same flower. This is called as self-pollination. But even if you have seen that pollen grains get transferred from the stamen of a flower to the stigma of the same flower, there is possibility that it can get transferred from the stamen of one flower to the stigma of another flower. As you can see in this module, the pollen grain is getting transferred. In the first case, it is getting transferred from the anther of the flower to the stigma of the same flower. That is self-pollination. In the second case, what do you see? That this anther, which is composed of pollen grains, is transferring the pollen grains to the stigma of another flower but of the same plant. As you can see, the stem is showing from the same stem these two flowers are grown. So it is the transfer of pollen grains from the stamen of one flower to the stigma of another flower of the same plant. This is also called as self-pollination. Why is it so? Because the pollen grains are being transferred within the same plant. That is why we call, in both the cases, it is self-pollination. The pollination is happening itself. That is the whole idea behind self-pollination. For the first type of self-pollination, the flower needs to be bisexual, meaning it should be composed of both the worlds, that is, the male reproductive part and the female reproductive part should be present in the same flower. On the other hand, if the flowers are unisexual, in case it is pistillate or staminate, then it needs to transfer the male flower, the stamen from the male flower to the pistil of the female flower. Then self-pollination will take place. But it should be the male flower and the female flower should belong to the same plant. So I suppose it's clear to everyone what is self-pollination. What is self-pollination? Self-pollination is the process where the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or different flower of the same plant. Now, what do you think is cross-pollination? Any guesses? Now you must know what is the meaning of cross-pollination as you have learned about self-pollination. Self means within the same plant. So cross means, yes, exactly, between two different plants but of the same species. Well, cross-pollination is transfer of pollen grains from one flower to another flower of different plants. So if the pollen grains are transferred from the stamen of one flower to the stigma of another flower of different plant, then this is what is called as cross-pollination, which takes place across two different plants. Of course, same species, which means same type of plant. So what is cross-pollination? Cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower of the same kind. Now, the question arises, how exactly does pollination happen? How do the flowers take the pollen grains and transfer it to the stigma? Do they have any moving parts? No, they don't have any moving parts. Well, so how it is carried? Pollination depends on certain agents, as we have discussed in the previous part of the chapter, in the previous part of the session itself, that there are pollinators. So the agents or pollinators are basically things that help in pollination. One of the most common agent you would find is wind. The pollen grains would just get spread into the air, as you can see in the module, and then the wind will carry the pollen grains forward, and because both the pollen grains and the stigma are sticky in nature, the pollen grain comes very close to the stigma and it will get stuck to it. And of course, in some cases they are not sticky, the pollen grains are not sticky, or maybe the stigma is not sticky. In those cases, it is hairy. Even then, the pollen grains will get entangled very nicely with the stigma, and when they are stuck to it, pollination takes place. So how pollination takes place? Through wind. Since the plants cannot move about, agents are required, and wind is the most common agent which helps in the transfer of pollen grains through the air. The flowers of plants like rice, maize, grass, etc., they are pollinated by wind. These plants have following characteristics. The flowers are small, not brightly colored. As you can see in the module, no flower is showing any attractive color. Even they do not produce nectar, or they do not have any smell too. So that means insects will not come in contact with it. Then the anthers, they produce large quantity of pollen grains. What is the reason to produce large quantity of pollen grains? Any idea? Any guesses? Yes, it produces a large quantity of pollen grains because, as you know, the agent for pollination is wind. So definitely when they are in the air, most of the pollen grains get destroyed. When they are moving in the air for pollination to take place, most of the pollen grains will get destroyed. They will not reach the target place. The pollen grains are small, very light in weight, smooth and also dry in nature, so that they can be easily carried by the wind. And the stigma of these flowers are large and feathery, so that it can easily catch the pollen grains which are flying in the wind. So I suppose it's clear to everyone how the pollination is taking place through wind. Very good. Now, just like wind helps in transferring pollen grains for land plants, water helps in transferring the pollen in aquatic plants. Pollination is brought about by water in aquatic plants like Vallisneria and lotus, as you can see in the module. In Vallisneria, as you can see in the module, there are two types of flowers visible: staminate flower and the pistillate flower. This is the staminate flower, that is the male flower, and this is the pistillate flower, that is the female flower. In Vallisneria, the male flowers are initially born under water. As you can see in the module, they are under water. And the male flowers, they get detached from the parent plant and floats on the surface of water. As you can see here, this staminate flower, the male flower, slowly it gets detached. It gets separated from the parent plant and it floats on the surface of water. It floats on the surface of water. And where is the female flower present? The female flower has a long stalk. As you can see, it is beginning from the root and it is reaching to the surface of the water. So it has long stalk which is reaching the female flower to the surface of water. So with the help of this stalk, the flower is able to float in water. Now this male flower, which is detached from the parent plant, comes in contact with the female flower which is floating on the surface. And when they come in contact, what will happen? The pollen grains of the male flower will get transferred to the female flowers, to the stigma of the female flowers, and thereby pollination will take place. So this is how pollination takes place by water. Then let's talk about cross-pollination. As you have learned, cross-pollination will take place when the pollen grains get transferred from one plant to another plant. Now these plants may be far apart. That is a possibility that the flowers in cross-pollination may be far apart. Two plants will not be very close to each other. So they are far apart. Then the chances of cross-pollination reduces, right? So how do we effectively increase the chances of cross-pollination? Any guesses? This is where the insects come into picture. This is another important agent for pollination, especially cross-pollination. Insects like bees, butterflies, moths, and even birds, they help in pollination. But the question is, how exactly do the insects pollinate? Let me tell you through an example. Here is an example of bee. Well, it's looking very beautiful. Now let's say that this bee is very hungry and it has spotted a flower. Why it has spotted a flower? Why the flower has attracted it? Because the flower was brightly colored. The petals were brightly colored. It had sweet smell and also nectar was present in it. What is nectar? Nectar is sugary secretion, sugary juice that is produced by the flowers near its base, and it has a lot of sugar. It has a lot of protein also. So it's perfect food for the hungry bee. So what these bees do? They get attracted to the particular flower. They sit on that flower and they start sucking nectar. And as they start sucking nectar, the pollen grains start sticking to the bees. As you can see here also, let me show you some more photos. Just look at this. You can see this honeybee is sucking nectar and it's resting its leg on the stamen. And so the pollen grains can easily stick to the bee. You can see a lot of pollen grains are stuck to the bee, and this bee is super busy. I think it's very hungry. So now you have understood that a lot of pollen grains easily get stuck to the bees or insects, and then when the bee decides to move away, it carries those pollen grains. Now the bee goes on its journey from one flower to another flower, and on its way it may spot another similar flower with similar fragrance, and then again it will get attracted to the flower. It will sit over it and start sucking the nectar from that flower. While doing that, some of the pollen grains will get transferred to the stigma and pollination, cross-pollination will take place. But it's very important that the bee needs to get attracted to the same species of the flower. For example, if there is papaya flower from which it has sucked nectar. Then on its way it needs to get attracted towards the papaya plant only, papaya flower only. It should not be a rose flower or mango flower. It should be particularly the papaya flower. So cross-pollination will take place. And it's for that reason usually certain bees are always attracted to certain kinds of flower that increases the chances of successful cross-pollination. These bees turn out to be a major contributor of pollination. Now, the next type of pollination takes place by animals. Some plants are pollinated by animals like birds, as you can see here, the hummingbird. It helps in pollination. Then squirrel may also help in pollination. Even bats, they help in pollination. So with this, we end up today's session. Hope to meet again. Till then, stay safe, stay home. God be with you all.